My name is Emily Cooper, I am 34 years old, and I never imagined that a simple family dinner could unravel everything I thought I understood about blood, loyalty, and belonging. That evening, the air around the dining table was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and rosemary, but beneath it there was something metallic, sharp, almost like the tang of hidden resentment that no one dared to name. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that seemed to punctuate every uncomfortable silence. My stepmother, Janet, sat across from me, her posture flawless, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of a wine glass as though even her gestures had to be perfect. The way she looked at me carried no warmth. Her eyes were as pale and brittle as the porcelain plates she had chosen for the occasion. She leaned slightly forward, her lips curling into something that might have passed for a smile if there had been even a flicker of sincerity behind it. "Sit this one out, Emily," she said softly, almost too softly, but her tone cut through the hum of conversation like the edge of a knife. Then with that glacial calmness that only she could master, she added, "Stay home, darling. This trip is for the real family." The words struck me harder than I expected, not because they were new but because they were so final. I felt my throat tighten, the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck. My father kept his eyes fixed on his plate, carving his meat as though he hadn't heard her, as though pretending not to notice would make it less cruel. My half-brother, Nathan, gave a short, nervous laugh that died in his throat when he realized no one else was laughing. For a few seconds no one moved. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the old clock seemed to hesitate. I looked at Janet, at the small, victorious tilt of her chin, the way she savored the silence that followed her words. In that moment I realized there was nothing I could say that would matter. So I did the only thing that felt right. I raised my hands and clapped, once, twice, 3 times, each sound echoing through the dining room like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had taken years to write. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, and far too loud for the delicate space we were sitting in. Janet's eyes widened just a fraction, a flicker of surprise breaking her mask, and my father finally looked up, confusion and discomfort shadowing his face. I could feel the heat of every gaze on me, but I stayed calm, almost detached. Then I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the polished floor, and stood. No one said a word as I picked up my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my plate. I could feel the tension rising like static, that dangerous electricity that builds right before a storm breaks. I walked away from the table without looking back, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step carrying me further from the suffocating pretense of family unity that had never truly existed. The dining room behind me filled with the sound of uneasy breathing and the faint tremor of someone's fork falling against a plate. I didn't turn around to see whose it was. As I reached the hallway, I could still hear Janet's whisper, too quiet for the others but meant for me. "Ungrateful girl," she murmured as though spitting out something distasteful. I didn't give her the satisfaction of responding. I had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any insult. The house seemed to watch me as I moved through it. The framed photos on the walls, the polished mirrors, even the old furniture that had belonged to my mother before Janet moved in. Everything here had been rearranged, replaced, repainted to fit Janet's version of beauty, and yet it all still felt haunted by something she couldn't erase. I paused by the window in the foyer, the glass cold beneath my fingertips. Outside, the mountains loomed dark against the dying light, their silhouettes sharp and endless. The trip Janet mentioned was supposed to be to that very place. A weekend at the old family cabin in the Colorado Rockies. It was my father's idea, or at least that's what he had said, but I could tell it had been orchestrated by her. She always had a way of turning every family event into a performance, and she never liked it when I appeared on her stage. I remembered when I was a child, before Janet came, how my mother would take me to that cabin. It was our sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, hot chocolate, and the smell of pine wood smoke. After my mother's death, my father rarely went there. Then Janet appeared, and suddenly the cabin became a family retreat, something polished and curated, stripped of its warmth. I was invited once years ago. It didn't go well. Since then, my place in this family had always been negotiable, something that could be rescinded with a single cutting remark. Standing there in the dim light, I could feel a deep, quiet fury building inside me, not the wild kind that makes you shout or throw things, but the slow, steady burn that makes every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. I wasn't angry because Janet had excluded me. I was angry because everyone else had let her. My father's silence was the worst part of it, a silence that told me he'd already chosen his peace over his daughter. When I finally walked up the stairs to my room, the house seemed to exhale around me as though relieved to see me go. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked older, more distant than I remembered. I thought about what Janet had said, "This trip is for the real family," and for the first time I realized that maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't belong in that picture anymore. But if she thought she could erase me from it entirely, she was wrong. I closed my bedroom door, letting the latch click into place, sealing me off from the murmurs and clinking glasses below. I sat on the edge of my bed, the faint hum of the night outside mixing with the low murmur of voices downstairs. The laughter returned, forced but steady, like a rehearsal of normalcy after a brief interruption. They would continue their dinner, pour more wine, pretend everything was fine. That was what this family did best, pretend. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster that spread out like veins. I knew that this dinner would be remembered not because of the food or the conversation, but because of the moment I stood up and walked away. Something had shifted, something small but irreversible. I didn't know yet what it meant, only that the echo of those 3 claps still lingered in the air, like the sound of something breaking quietly inside a house full of strangers who once called themselves family. 2 days after that dinner, as the uneasy quiet between us all settled like dust, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, plain, cream-colored, with my father's handwriting on it. The familiar tilt of his letters made my stomach twist for a moment before I noticed something strange. The name on the front wasn't mine. It was addressed to Janet. My first thought was that it must have been delivered by mistake, but my address was written neatly beneath hers, as if someone had wanted to make sure it reached me but didn't want me to know it was meant for someone else. The paper felt heavy between my fingers, the kind of weight that comes not from the paper itself but from what might be inside it. I sat at the small wooden table by my window, the afternoon light cutting through the blinds in sharp, pale stripes that fell across the envelope. I could see faint impressions where the pen had pressed too hard, carving traces of words through the paper. My pulse quickened. My father wasn't one for letters. He barely texted me, and when he did, it was short and polite, never warm. Something about the deliberate choice of handwriting, of putting thoughts into ink, felt ominous. I hesitated for a moment, running my thumb along the sealed edge. It felt almost like betrayal to open it, but then again so did everything they had done lately. With a careful tear I broke the seal. Inside were 3 folded sheets, written in his familiar script, steady but firm, with small corrections where he had crossed out words, as if even he wasn't sure what he was doing. I unfolded the first page and began to read. It started innocently enough, almost like a note between 2 business partners rather than husband and wife. He wrote about the necessary paperwork and the upcoming trip, and then as I read on, the tone changed. He mentioned the cabin transfer, legal consolidation, and ensuring Emily's compliance. I read that line again, slower this time, the words burning into my mind. Ensuring my compliance. My breath caught in my throat. They were planning to take the house. Not the one we lived in, the one that truly mattered. My mother's house. Her sanctuary. The place she had left to me in her will, years before Janet even came into our lives. It wasn't just a piece of property in the mountains, it was everything that remained of her. Every photograph, every hand-carved shelf, every quiet hour we'd spent watching storms roll over the peaks. It all belonged to me. And they were planning to take it legally, quietly, as if I wouldn't notice until it was already done. The next page was worse. My father's tone shifted from cautious to calculating. He detailed steps, how Janet would persuade him to reinvest in the property, how Nathan's name could be added for family continuity, how they could file to have my ownership contested under claims of mismanagement. I could see Janet's influence in every word, her precision, her obsession with appearances. The plan wasn't rash, it was methodical, thought through down to the last signature. They wanted to turn my mother's legacy into a shared family asset, then into Janet's trophy. For a long time I just sat there, the letter spread out in front of me like a confession. My heart should have been pounding, my hands shaking, but instead I felt a strange calm. A deep, hollow stillness settled inside me. It was as though every lingering illusion I had about who my father really was had finally disintegrated. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was how predictable it felt. I leaned back in my chair, the wooden frame creaking softly. Outside, a few flakes of snow drifted past the window, slow and silent. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind, that soft, steady tone she used whenever she was explaining something to me as a child. "Never let them decide who you are," she used to say. I smiled at the memory, a faint, bitter smile that felt more like armor than comfort. I looked back down at the pages, rereading the lines about compliance and family settlement. They thought I was still that naive little girl who cried when Janet rearranged my mother's photographs, who begged for my father's attention, who believed that love could be earned through patience. But that girl was gone. Somewhere between the funeral, the years of polite cruelty, and that dinner 2 nights ago, she had vanished. What remained was someone quieter, colder, and infinitely more careful. I folded the pages back along their creases, sliding them into the envelope with deliberate precision. I didn't shred it. I didn't throw it away. I placed it inside a small wooden box on my desk, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar. My mother had once told me that the things people try to hide usually tell you more than the things they show. This letter was proof, not just of their plan but of who they truly were. As I sat there, I thought about the cabin, the tall trees surrounding it, the faint smell of pine and smoke, the creak of the floorboards that had once terrified me at night but now felt like a heartbeat. That house was all I had left of her, and they wanted to take it as though it were some trinket to be traded. I traced my fingers over the edge of the table, my thoughts already weaving through what I needed to do next. Not in anger but in clarity. The evening sun was fading now, and the last of the light turned the snow outside into a dim amber glow. I could feel something shifting inside me, not a burst of rage but a steady, controlled resolve. They thought they were being clever, orchestrating things behind closed doors, hiding their intentions in polite words and legal terms. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't the one who would be blindsided this time. As the shadows deepened across the room, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. My face looked different in that half-light, older, sharper, calmer. I smiled, a small, deliberate smile, the kind that comes when you finally see something clearly. They had sent their letter to the wrong person. Or maybe, in a way, to exactly the right one. My mother, Laura, was the center of my world, the kind of person whose presence filled a room without ever needing to raise her voice. She carried a calm strength, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, something ancient and unbreakable. She was warmth in motion, laughter that drifted through open windows in the summer, and the soft hum of an old song that never quite left your memory. Everything I learned about life began with her. She was the one who held the back of my bicycle the first time I tried to balance, running behind me down the gravel path that led to the lake, shouting encouragement as her hand slowly slipped away and I realized, terrified and exhilarated, that I was pedaling on my own. When I fell, she didn't rush to pick me up. She walked, slow and steady, smiling, waiting for me to stand. "You'll always fall first," she told me once, brushing the dirt from my knee, "but what matters is how you rise." Every summer we would leave the noise of the city behind and drive for hours through winding roads until the air grew thinner and sharper, filled with pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. Her family estate in Colorado wasn't a mansion, but it felt like a kingdom. The house stood at the edge of a forest, its white walls aged by mountain weather, the roof dark and steep, the windows tall and old-fashioned. It smelled of cedar and old books, of coffee in the mornings and rain on the porch in the afternoons. That was our world, our secret place. We would spend hours on the wraparound porch, her with a book in her lap and me sketching in the margins of her gardening journals. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the peaks, she would light the lanterns one by one, and we'd sit wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind move through the trees like a whispering sea. She loved teaching me things, not just how to do them but how to feel them. When I was small, she taught me to bake bread, to listen to the rhythm of the dough beneath my palms, to understand when it was ready not by recipe but by instinct. When I grew older, she talked about grief, about the way it settles quietly into your life and never fully leaves. "It's not an enemy," she told me once, her voice soft but steady. "It's just a reminder that you've loved deeply." That was who she was. She made even pain sound like something noble, something to be understood rather than feared. The last summer before she died still plays in my mind in pieces. The way the sunlight filtered through the aspen trees, the sound of the river nearby, the smell of her favorite lilac soap. She had been ill, though she tried to hide it from me. I remember how she would get tired climbing the stairs, how her laughter grew softer, slower, as if each sound required effort. I was 15, old enough to notice but too young to understand what it meant. When she told me one evening that everything would be fine, her eyes said something different. There was a heaviness there, a resignation masked by love. I didn't realize then that she was preparing me, that every story she told and every piece of advice she gave was part of a quiet goodbye. When she passed away, the world felt smaller, flatter, as though the color had been drained from it. The house that had once been so full of life suddenly felt hollow. The laughter that had echoed through its halls was replaced by silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on everything. My father, David, withdrew into himself, his grief buried under ledgers and numbers. He was a good man once, or at least I believed he was, but he didn't know how to carry loss. He stopped going to the cabin for a long time. He stopped talking about her altogether. Work became his refuge. Spreadsheets, reports, meetings, all of it a way to avoid what hurt too much to face. At 15, I would wander through the empty rooms alone, tracing my fingers over the faded wallpaper, listening to the faint creaks of the house as if waiting for it to speak. The smell of my mother's perfume lingered in the hallways for months, faint but unmistakable, like the ghost of a memory refusing to fade. Sometimes I would find one of her scarves tucked between books or a pressed flower inside her journals, and for a few seconds it would feel like she was still there. I spent hours sitting by the old piano she loved, though I never learned to play. The keys were cold beneath my fingers, and every time I pressed one, the sound echoed through the house like a reminder of what was gone. My father and I grew distant without ever fighting. There were no arguments, no explosions of anger, just silence. Meals became quiet rituals of avoidance. He would ask if I had finished my homework, I would nod, and that would be it. The bond between us dissolved quietly, like something left out in the rain too long. He started staying late at work, coming home when I was already in bed. Sometimes I would hear him moving through the kitchen at night, his footsteps slow and uneven, the clink of a glass against the counter. I think he tried to keep the house for me at first, tried to make it feel like home, but the grief consumed him differently. Where I clung to memories, he buried them. The summer after she died, he locked the doors of the Colorado estate and told me we wouldn't go back for a while. Too many memories, he said, though the words came out flat like an excuse. That was the last time we spoke about it until years later, when the property became more than a memory. It became the line dividing what was left of our family. But back then I didn't understand that yet. I just knew that my mother's world had ended, and mine had become a quiet echo of what used to be. Even now, when I think of her, I see her standing by the porch railing at dusk, her hair caught in the wind, her hand raised in that familiar wave as I ran down the path to fetch something she'd forgotten. The air smelled of pine and sunlight, and the sound of the river carried softly through the valley. That's how I keep her with me, frozen in that golden hour of a life that feels like another lifetime. She taught me everything that mattered, and when she left, she took the light with her. What remained was the shadow of her world and me trying to live inside it. A few months after my mother's death, when the house had settled into a rhythm of silence so deep that even my own footsteps sounded intrusive, my father brought home Janet. She arrived like a gust of cold air, sharp and composed, wearing perfume that smelled expensive and artificial, the kind that clung to every surface long after she'd left the room. There was nothing hesitant about her, no trace of gentleness or humility that one might expect from someone stepping into the shadow of another woman's memory. She stood in the doorway that first evening as though she already owned the place, her eyes moving over the furniture, the walls, the photographs, assessing everything, cataloging it. My father looked nervous beside her, trying too hard to make everything appear natural, to make me smile, to pretend that this was something ordinary. A friend, a visitor, nothing more. But I could already feel it. This woman wasn't passing through. She was settling in. With Janet came her son, Ethan. He was 13 at the time, a quiet, watchful boy with dark hair that fell over his forehead and eyes that rarely met mine. He spoke little, answering questions with short phrases or nods. There was something uncertain about him, as if he had learned that silence was safer than words. I tried to reach him in the ways I knew how. I helped him fix his bicycle when the chain slipped off, sitting beside him in the driveway, grease on my hands and sunlight on our backs. I showed him how to aim better when we kicked a football around the yard, laughing when he missed and cheering when he didn't. For brief moments when he forgot himself, I saw flashes of the boy he might have been, shy but kind, curious but cautious. But Janet was always there, watching. She had a way of entering a room without sound, her presence filling the space before her voice did. She would smile when she saw us together, but it was a smile too polished, too controlled. "That's sweet," she would say, her tone carrying something brittle beneath the surface, something that made the air shift. She didn't like it when Ethan and I grew close. I could see it in the small tightening around her mouth, in the way she would suddenly call him inside for no reason, her voice perfectly calm but unyielding. From the beginning, she carried herself like someone auditioning for a role she'd already decided she deserved. Her laughter was a little too loud, her compliments a little too measured, and every gesture felt deliberate. Within a few weeks, her things began to appear around the house. A silk scarf draped over a chair, perfume bottles arranged neatly on the bathroom shelf, a photo of her and my father at some restaurant, smiling under warm lights. It was as if she were rewriting the story of our home one object at a time, erasing what came before. My father seemed lighter around her, in a way that made me uncomfortable. He smiled more, but it was a different smile, nervous, eager to please. He spoke about starting fresh, about how change can be good for us. I wanted to believe him, to think that maybe he had found something that helped him heal, but even then I could sense the imbalance. Janet didn't seem like someone who wanted to share a life. She wanted to control it. She had a way of folding herself into conversations, subtly steering them, her voice smooth and persuasive. When she laughed, he laughed. When she disapproved, he grew quiet. It didn't take long before her influence became visible in everything. The way meals were cooked, the way the furniture was rearranged, even the way he spoke to me. One afternoon, not long after they moved in, I found Janet in the living room with a stack of my mother's old photographs spread across the table. She was sorting them into two piles. When she noticed me, she didn't look startled. She looked composed, almost expectant. Your father thought it might be good to organize these, she said casually, her manicured fingers sliding one photo aside. We'll keep the important ones, of course. I stood there, my throat tightening as I watched her touch those fragile pieces of my mother's world with hands that didn't belong to it. I didn't argue, I just turned and walked away. That night when I came back to the living room, half the photos were gone. Ethan, for all his quietness, noticed things. Sometimes he would glance at me across the dinner table when Janet made a sharp remark or corrected me for something small, and in that fleeting look, I could tell he understood more than he said. He lived under her rules too, though his defiance was quieter. There were nights when I could hear them arguing in low voices behind their closed door, her words fast and clipped, his soft and trembling. By morning, everything would be silent again as though nothing had happened. Over time, the house began to feel less like home and more like a stage set designed for someone else's comfort. The walls that once held warmth now carried the faint echo of Janet's commands. She changed the curtains, repainted the kitchen, replaced my mother's handmade quilts with sterile, decorative throws. My father didn't stop her. He said things like, "It's just a house," or "She's trying to make it feel new," as if newness could replace memory. I wanted to scream, but instead I learned to speak less, to move quietly, to become invisible in my own home. Still, I tried to find small ways to exist around the edges of her control. I would take Ethan to the park after school, pretending it was for his sake, but in truth it was for mine. The sound of the wind through the trees, the crunch of gravel under our shoes. It reminded me of summers with my mother. Ethan never said much, but sometimes he'd tell me little things about his old life before they moved in, about the school he missed, the friends he never got to say goodbye to. There was a softness in him that Janet tried to harden. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that I began to realize Janet didn't just want to fit into our family. She wanted to redefine it entirely. She started introducing herself as Ethan's and Emily's mother. When she spoke to neighbors or family friends, her tone smooth and effortless. The first time she did it, I froze. My father smiled awkwardly, not correcting her, and I felt something inside me fracture just a little. I saw then that this wasn't about love or companionship. It was about territory, about ownership. Of him, of Ethan, of me, of the home that once belonged to my mother. From that point on, things changed in quiet, deliberate ways. My father began to spend more time away, traveling for work, leaving the house under her control. Janet took that power easily, like she had been waiting for it. She set rules, corrected my tone, reminded me to be grateful for her efforts to bring order into our lives. Her voice was calm, never raised, but it carried a weight that made every word sound like law. And through it all she smiled. Always that same perfect smile, polished and cold, as if to remind me that she had already won. I didn't fight her, not then. I kept helping Ethan with his bike, kept pretending everything was normal. But deep down I understood that Janet wasn't building a family. She was building a hierarchy, one where she stood firmly at the top, and the rest of us existed only to hold her place steady. It began so subtly that at first I almost convinced myself it was coincidence. Little omissions, small absences, moments that felt too minor to name but too deliberate to ignore. The first time it happened, Janet and my father went on a weekend trip without telling me. I found out only when I came home from work to an empty house, the note on the counter short and impersonal. "We're away for a few days, don't wait up." No destination, no explanation, no mention of why I hadn't been invited. I remember standing there in the kitchen, staring at the neat handwriting, the smell of her perfume still hanging in the air like a taunt. At first I told myself I didn't care, that I needed the quiet anyway. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like erasure. After that, the pattern became clear. Family dinners that I learned about only afterward. Photos taken at events I hadn't known were happening. My name conveniently missing from group messages or lists. When I confronted my father once, softly, cautiously, he looked genuinely confused, as if he hadn't noticed. "You're always busy," he said, his voice tired, dismissive, like he wanted the conversation to end before it began. But I wasn't busy. I was just being written out, one absence at a time. Janet was clever that way. She never needed open confrontation. She simply rearranged reality until her version became the only one visible. Then came the moment that stripped away any illusion I had left. It was an ordinary afternoon, sunlight spilling across the living room floor, the dust floating like golden flecks in the air. Janet was standing near the window, her posture elegant as always, flipping through a magazine. Her sleeve slid back as she reached for her glass of water, and I saw it. A bracelet, delicate and unmistakable, catching the light in a way that made my breath stop. My mother's bracelet. Silver with a tiny engraving on the inside, the initials, LC, barely visible unless you knew to look. For a second I thought I was imagining it. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, my voice breaking through the air before I even realized I was speaking. Where did you get that? I asked. Janet looked up, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. She followed my gaze to the bracelet, then smiled faintly as if I had just commented on the weather. This, she said lightly, running her fingers over it. Oh, David gave it to me. It's just a piece of jewelry, dear. You shouldn't look so serious. Just a piece of jewelry. I could feel the blood drain from my face. That bracelet had been my mother's favorite. I remembered watching her put it on in the mornings, the way she would fasten it with care before heading into the garden or out to the porch. It had been a gift from my grandmother, something she never took off except at night. After she died, it disappeared. I had searched for it once years ago quietly and without asking, thinking maybe my father had kept it somewhere safe. I never found it. And now it was here, wrapped neatly around Janet's wrist as though it had always belonged to her. In that instant I realized it wasn't about the bracelet itself. It was about the message. She was claiming pieces of my mother. Objects, memories, symbols, and folding them into her own world until there was no distinction left between what was hers and what had been ours. She wasn't just replacing my mother, she was rewriting her existence. Slowly, methodically, she was scraping her name from the walls of our lives. I stood there, frozen, every muscle in my body taut with something that felt dangerously close to rage. But Janet's expression never changed. She looked at me with the same serene patience she always wore when she wanted to remind me of my place. It's beautiful, isn't it? She said, turning her wrist slightly so the light caught the silver. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, waiting for my reaction. I said nothing. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my voice lodged somewhere deep inside me. My father walked in a few minutes later, carrying a stack of papers, and she greeted him with that soft, honeyed tone she reserved for him alone. Darling, thank you again for this, she said, brushing her fingers over the bracelet. He smiled absently, not even noticing the shift in the air, not realizing what that small circle of silver represented. It looks good on you, he said before walking out of the room. That was when I knew he had given it to her willingly. Whether it was out of forgetfulness or indifference didn't matter. What mattered was that he had allowed it, and by doing so he had let her cross a line that could never be uncrossed. For the rest of the day I couldn't shake the image of it. The silver glint against her skin, the way it seemed to mock the memory of the woman who once wore it. Every time she lifted her hand, it caught the light and pulled at something deep inside me. I began to notice other things too. The vase from my mother's study that had reappeared in the dining room, filled with fresh lilies. The quilt my mother had made, folded neatly at the foot of Janet's bed when I passed by her open door. Even the scent of my mother's old perfume, faint but familiar, trailing Janet's movements like a ghost. Each change was small, almost imperceptible on its own, but together they formed a quiet, merciless campaign. Janet was replacing the texture of our home with her own, stripping away the fingerprints my mother had left behind. And my father, whether through grief or denial, let her. His silence became her permission, his inaction her power. That was when I stopped pretending that things could return to what they once were. I understood then that this was not a household. It was a quiet war. And Janet fought not with shouts or anger but with presence. With her calm, her charm, her deliberate patience. Every object she claimed, every moment she excluded me from, every look she gave was a move in a game she knew she was winning. I told myself I would not give her the satisfaction of reaction. But that night when the house was finally still, I went into my room, sat on the edge of my bed and let the silence swallow me whole. My mother's world was fading from the walls, but in that silence I made myself a promise. I would not let her vanish entirely. Not from memory, not from me. Even if Janet managed to erase every visible trace, she would never understand the weight of what she was trying to destroy. The quiet, enduring love that no bracelet could ever replace. My mother had always been the kind of woman who planned everything down to the smallest detail. And even in death she managed to protect me in ways I didn't understand until much later. In her will, she had been precise, almost surgical in her wording, leaving no room for interpretation or manipulation. The family estate in Colorado, the one that had belonged to her family for generations, the house that had held our summers, our laughter and her quiet strength, was to pass entirely to me when I turned 25. Until then my father could live there, use it and maintain it, but he was forbidden to sell, rent or alter its ownership in any way. It was her way of drawing a line around the only piece of our world that could not be taken, her final safeguard against everything she must have sensed might come after her. At 15, when the lawyer read the document to us, I didn't fully grasp its meaning. I remember sitting in that small office, the air stale with the smell of paper and ink, while my father listened with a rigid jaw and empty eyes. Janet wasn't there yet, not officially part of our lives, but even then my mother must have known that one day there would be someone else, someone who would try to rewrite what she had built. Her foresight both comforted and haunted me. It meant she had anticipated her absence, had prepared for the world to turn cold in her wake. When I left for college in California years later, the will was little more than a line in the back of my mind, a silent promise waiting to come true. I told myself I needed distance, that I had to carve out something of my own far away from the house that had once been my entire universe. The move felt like breathing for the first time after years of holding it in. California was different. Louder, brighter, chaotic in a way that made me forget, at least for a while, how heavy silence could feel. I threw myself into design school, spending long nights in dim studios surrounded by sketches and fabrics, letting creation fill the spaces grief had hollowed out. By the time I graduated, Portland called to me with its rain and its quiet creativity. I found a small apartment there, nothing like the vastness of my childhood home, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, the windows fogged on winter mornings, yet it felt like freedom. I began working for a small design firm, the kind that valued vision over profit, and for the first time in years I felt a rhythm that was my own. My hands were busy, my mind focused, and I convinced myself that the past had lost its hold. But no matter how far I went, the house in Colorado lived in me like a memory etched into bone. There were nights when the scent of pine or the sound of wind against my window would pull me back there, to the porch where my mother and I used to sit in the fading light, to the quiet hum of her voice as she spoke about strength, about building something that lasts. I didn't visit often after my 21st birthday. Each return felt more foreign, the house colder, more controlled under Janet's presence. The last time I had gone, she had rearranged the furniture in the living room and replaced my mother's handmade curtains with sleek, beige drapes that matched nothing in the house. My father had smiled as though it were progress, as though turning the place into something sterile made it easier to live in. I hadn't argued. I had simply left earlier than planned. From Portland I kept my distance. Phone calls with my father grew shorter, rarer. He asked about work, about the weather, never about the will or the house. It was as though those things existed behind a locked door neither of us wanted to open. Still, I knew that my 25th birthday loomed like a quiet deadline, and part of me wondered if he thought about it too. The idea that the property would no longer be his to control, that the one thing Janet couldn't legally claim would slip through her perfectly manicured fingers. It must have lingered between them. When I turned 25, I signed the final papers in Portland, in a small notary office that smelled faintly of rain and coffee. The lawyer confirmed what my mother had arranged years ago. The estate was now fully mine. No conditions, no shared rights, no loopholes. I remember sitting there afterward, my hand resting on the documents, feeling an ache that was both pride and sorrow. It wasn't about possession. It was about the quiet, enduring love my mother had built into every line of that will. She had thought beyond her own life, ensuring that the only piece of her world untouched by Janet's ambition would remain safe in my hands. For years, that piece of paper stayed tucked away in a drawer in my apartment, sealed in a folder I rarely opened. I didn't need to. I knew what it said, and I knew it would be there if I ever needed proof of who I was, of what she had left me. Sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would think of the estate. Its tall windows, the creak of the porch steps, the view of the mountains that my mother had loved so much. And I would feel the weight of what she had trusted me to protect. Leaving home hadn't been an escape. It had been a survival. Distance became my shield. In Portland, I learned to speak in the language of design, of creation, to translate memory into form and color instead of words. But even as I built a life of my own, the legacy my mother had left behind lingered quietly in the background, waiting. Her foresight had been both a gift and a warning, a reminder that love in her hands had always been protection disguised as grace. Looking back now, I realize that every choice she made in that will carried a message meant only for me. That strength doesn't always come from confrontation, sometimes it comes from patience. That the things worth keeping don't have to be loud to endure. I lived my life far from Colorado, far from the weight of my father's silence and Janet's control, but the knowledge of that inheritance remained a quiet pulse beneath everything I did. My mother had given me more than a house. She had given me the right to remember, and the means to reclaim what was mine when the time came. After that dinner, the one where her words sliced through the air like the edge of a knife, Janet stopped pretending. Subtle cruelty and quiet manipulation had always been her preferred weapons, but now she was moving into open warfare. I didn't see it immediately. Her power had always been in her ability to make things appear harmless, but the first sign came in the form of a letter from the county recorder's office, a dry piece of bureaucratic correspondence that didn't seem remarkable until I noticed the name attached to a property transfer request. It wasn't mine. It was hers. At first I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, some mix-up in the system. But the more I read, the colder I felt. She had filed preliminary papers to amend the ownership of the estate, citing familial consolidation and inheritance realignment. The language was careful, designed to look legitimate to anyone skimming through, but I knew better. This wasn't an administrative oversight. It was a calculated move, one that required access to information she shouldn't have had. Documents, signatures, even the original title. I called my friend Megan that night, my hands shaking as I read the letter aloud over the phone. Megan had known me since college, back when I still believed the past could be outrun. She listened without interrupting, the quiet on the other end of the line heavier than any words. When I finally stopped, she exhaled sharply. "She's not just greedy," she said, her voice low and certain. "She's desperate. Nobody risks forgery unless they're running out of options. You need to dig deeper, Em. Find out how far she's already gone." Her words jolted something awake in me. Desperate. It made sense. Janet had always built her power on control. Over my father, over the house, over perception itself. Losing the estate meant losing the one thing that symbolized her victory. The timing was no coincidence either. My 25th birthday had passed less than a year ago, meaning the property was now legally and irrevocably mine. But rather than accept that, she was trying to rewrite history. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Lisa Moore was recommended by a colleague at work. A woman known for her composure and her ability to dismantle even the most complex family disputes with precision. When I arrived at her office in downtown Portland, the air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, the walls lined with framed legal certificates and neat shelves of case files. She listened carefully as I explained everything, from the will my mother had written to the letter from the county. Her eyes narrowed slightly when I showed her the documents. "If she's really filed something under your name, we'll find out," she said calmly, tapping her pen against the desk. "But forgery leaves traces. Paper trails, timestamps, witness names. People like her always leave fingerprints on their lies." Over the next few days, Lisa and her assistant combed through public records, property archives, and probate filings. I went about my days in a strange state of stillness, my body moving through routine while my mind churned beneath the surface. Every email notification, every phone call made my chest tighten with anticipation. When Lisa finally called, her voice was steady but carried that particular gravity that comes when someone has found something they wish they hadn't. "Emily," she said, "you might want to sit down." I remember sitting at my small kitchen table, my laptop open, the afternoon light dimming outside as the rain began to fall against the window. Lisa continued, her tone measured but firm. "Janet didn't just try to file a transfer recently. She's done this before. 9 years ago to be exact. There's an old court record, quietly sealed but not erased. She attempted to contest your mother's will shortly after it was executed. She argued that your mother was mentally unfit at the time of signing, claiming undue influence." For a moment, everything around me blurred. 9 years ago. I would have been 16, still raw from loss, still trying to make sense of a world that no longer had my mother in it. Janet had already been in our lives then, not officially married to my father yet, but close enough to circle. The thought that she had tried to dismantle my mother's final act of love before the ground beneath the grave had even settled made my skin crawl. Lisa went on, explaining how the case had been dismissed almost immediately. There wasn't enough evidence, and my mother's lawyer had been meticulous in her documentation. Every medical certificate, every witness statement, every notarized signature had been airtight. Janet had been forced to withdraw her challenge quietly, and the record was buried in the archive, forgotten, until now. "She must have assumed no one would ever find it," Lisa said. "But it's there, plain as day. She's tried this once before, and now she's trying again, more carefully, more desperately." I sat there in silence long after the call ended, the rain turning heavier against the glass, the sound filling the room like static. My mind replayed every moment from the past few years, her controlling smile, her calculated charm, the way she had always spoken about the estate with that particular possessive lilt, as if it already belonged to her. The pattern was clear now. She had been waiting for the right moment, for the legal timing to shift in her favor, for my father's complacency to deepen, for me to be far enough away to react too late. I thought of my mother then, her foresight, her precision, her quiet understanding of people. She must have known this was coming. That's why the will had been written the way it was. She hadn't just been protecting the house. She had been protecting me from the very woman who was now clawing at its foundations. Later that night, I pulled out the copy of my mother's will from the drawer where it had sat untouched for years. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. I read each line carefully, tracing my mother's logic, her clarity, her strength. And as I did, the pieces fell into place. Janet's obsession wasn't simply about greed. It was about control, about rewriting history so that she could stand at the center of a story that had never been hers to begin with. When I closed the document, my reflection caught in the darkened window across from me. The look in my eyes was unfamiliar, not the timid patience I had worn for years, but something sharper, steadier. Megan had been right. Janet wasn't just greedy. She was desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. When Lisa called me that morning, I knew from the tone of her voice that something had shifted. There was no hesitation, no soft preamble, just a steady, deliberate quiet that carried the weight of something irreversible. "Emily," she said, "we found it." The way she spoke those words made my stomach tighten. I sat at my desk, staring at the muted light of my computer screen, the faint hum of the city outside my apartment window sounding far away. "Found what?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "The transfer document," she replied. "The one Janet filed. It's fake. The signature isn't yours." She sent me the scanned copy a few minutes later. I opened the file and froze. There it was, my name written in black ink across the bottom of a legal property transfer document. Smooth, confident, and disturbingly familiar. My own handwriting, or at least a convincing imitation of it. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing every curve of every letter, comparing it to the way I sign my name on checks, on contracts, on the back of envelopes. Whoever had done it knew the details. The long loop in my Y, the narrow cross on my T, the slight rightward slant of the whole line. But it wasn't mine. The pressure was wrong, the rhythm mechanical. It looked like me but without the life of me. It was a forgery crafted by someone who had studied me too closely. Lisa had already confirmed what I feared. The document had been officially submitted to the county registrar's office 2 weeks earlier. Janet had claimed that I had agreed to transfer the estate into a shared trust, a move she justified in the paperwork as a necessary step to preserve family continuity. She had even attached a notarization page, fake of course, complete with an invented seal and a falsified witness signature. The thoroughness of it made my skin crawl. She hadn't just tried to take what was mine, she had built an entire illusion around it. That evening Megan came over. She didn't knock, just walked straight in, her face pale but determined. She carried a thick folder in her hands, her laptop tucked under one arm. "We're printing everything," she said, setting her things down on the table. Together we spread out the evidence piece by piece until my living room looked like an investigation board. There were printed emails, copies of the forged deed, screenshots of online records showing Janet's submission, and photos pulled from social media. Janet's posts, my father's comments, and one image that made my throat go dry. It was a picture of Ethan standing on the porch of the Colorado house. The caption beneath it read, "Our family home finally where it belongs." The words hit me harder than I expected. Ethan, who had once been that quiet boy I'd tried to protect, smiling shyly in the camera, unaware or unwilling to see what his mother was doing. Behind him, I could see the faint outline of the mountains, the same view I had grown up with, now repurposed as a prop in her deception. The sight of it made my chest ache in a way that felt almost physical. Megan handed me another printout. "These are the county records," she said, her voice tight. "The filing date, the reference number, even the submission email. It's all traced back to Janet's account. She didn't even bother to hide her trail." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped through them. The realization settled over me slowly, like cold water spreading through my veins. This wasn't just family conflict, not another manipulation I could ignore until it faded. This was deliberate fraud. A crime. The evidence was undeniable. The forged signature, the falsified notary seal, the submission under her name, and even the language of the document itself. All of it constructed with care and arrogance. She must have believed I wouldn't notice, or maybe she thought I wouldn't have the courage to fight back. For years she had controlled everything through subtlety, through social pressure and emotional exhaustion. But this was different. This was something tangible, something she couldn't disguise behind charm or civility. I kept looking at the fake signature, that twisted mirror version of my name. It was strange how personal it felt, as if she had taken something intimate from me, studied it, replicated it, and used it to erase me from my own story. The thought made my stomach turn. I thought about my mother, about how she had taken such care to ensure that the house would remain safe. And now here was Janet, desecrating that protection with her lies, her ink, her arrogance. Megan sat beside me, her expression tight but steady. "We're not letting her get away with this," she said. "This isn't just manipulation anymore. It's forgery, fraud, probably perjury too. She's crossed into criminal territory." I nodded slowly, still staring at the papers spread out before us. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the printer as it finished the last batch of documents. We stacked everything neatly, labeling each piece of evidence. Lisa had told us to keep copies of everything, digital and physical, just in case. By the time we were done, the coffee table was covered with proof. Timelines, statements, records, screenshots. Megan took a photo of the entire layout on her phone, timestamping it. I looked around at the chaos, at the fragments of my life turned into exhibits in a case that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something close to disbelief. It struck me then how far Janet had gone, how methodically she had blurred the line between manipulation and crime. She had spent years building a story in which she was the rightful matriarch, the savior of a fractured family, the woman who brought order to chaos. And now she had tried to make that story real, rewriting the law itself to fit her narrative. But this time she had gone too far. As I gathered the papers into a folder, my hand brushed over the photo of Ethan again. His expression haunted me, the innocence of it twisted by the caption beneath. I wondered if he understood any of what his mother was doing, if he even realized how deep her deceit ran. But then I remembered the way she controlled everything around her, how easily she bent truth into performance. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he did and didn't know how to stop her. When Megan finally left, the room felt oppressively quiet. I sat there for a long time, the documents still spread across the table, the false signature staring back at me like an accusation. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and reflective under the streetlights. The air smelled of wet asphalt and cold iron. I could feel something shifting inside me, not anger exactly but a hard, deliberate resolve. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about truth and about my mother's legacy being dragged through the mud by someone who believed she could take everything and leave me with nothing. The line had been crossed and there was no going back. When the reality of what Janet had done finally settled in, I realized that it wasn't enough to collect evidence from a distance anymore. I needed eyes and ears inside the place that had once been my mother's home. I needed to see the truth for myself. The idea of returning there after everything that had happened made my stomach twist, but it also felt inevitable. The estate was mine in name, but I had been kept away from it for too long, turned into a ghost in the very house that bore my family's name. I wasn't going to let her keep it that way. Lisa helped me find someone reliable, a private security consultant named Mark Johnson. He was a quiet man, deliberate in movement and words, with a kind of calm that comes from years of working with people in crisis. When he arrived at the estate, the afternoon sun was fading behind the mountains, turning the windows to mirrors. I stood on the porch as he stepped out of his truck, carrying a black case filled with equipment. "We'll start with cameras and access control," he said, scanning the exterior of the house with a professional's eye. "Hidden placements, no visible indicators. You'll be able to monitor everything remotely." For the first time in years I stepped inside the house not as a visitor but as its rightful owner. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, the scent of staged cleanliness that Janet favored. The rooms were immaculate, too immaculate, like a showroom rather than a home. My mother's paintings were gone, replaced with sterile prints. The shelves were lined with expensive ornaments that meant nothing. I could almost feel her absence pressing against me, a quiet reminder of how much had been taken. Mark moved efficiently, unpacking small wireless cameras and sleek digital locks, explaining each device as he worked. "Motion detection here, entry alerts at all doors, pressure sensors on the windows," he said, marking spots with small adhesive tabs. I followed him from room to room, watching as he restored a sense of security to a place that had long ago stopped feeling safe. When we reached my mother's study, the one room Janet had never completely claimed, I paused at the doorway. The smell of paper and cedar lingered faintly, like an echo of another time. I told Mark to install an additional camera there. It was later that afternoon, as he began setting up the main control panel in the living room, that he found the first piece of proof we hadn't been looking for. He was checking the network connection for the system when he asked for access to the house's existing Wi-Fi router. I gave him permission, assuming it was routine. 10 minutes later he called me over, his expression calm but focused. "Emily," he said, turning the laptop toward me, "you might want to see this." On the screen was a series of financial documents, emails, statements, and transaction logs. They weren't supposed to be there. Janet had apparently been using the same network for her personal and business correspondence, and some of her files had been automatically backed up to a shared cloud folder. The folder name was innocuous, House Maintenance, but inside it was something else entirely. Dozens of PDFs and spreadsheets, each one more damning than the last. Mark clicked through them quietly, his voice even. "These are wire transfers," he said. "Regular amounts, consistent intervals. And they're not small." The records showed Janet moving money from my father's company accounts, small sums at first, then larger, more frequent ones, into her own private bank account under a different name. The transfers had been masked as consulting fees and property management services, but the pattern was unmistakable. She had been siphoning funds for months, maybe longer, right under my father's nose. I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling the familiar mix of disbelief and inevitability wash over me. It shouldn't have surprised me anymore, her greed, her control, but the sheer brazenness of it left me breathless. She hadn't been satisfied with the house or the inheritance. She had been draining his company too, bleeding him quietly while pretending to keep his life in order. Then came the email chain that made my blood run cold. Mark opened a folder labeled Projects, and among invoices and financial statements was a thread of correspondence between Janet and a real estate agent. The subject line read, Property Listing Inquiry, Colorado Estate. I felt the air leave my lungs as I read the first message, written in her crisp, professional tone. I represent the current owners of the Cooper property, it began. We're exploring a discreet sale, ideally private, before the end of the quarter. The agent had responded politely, attaching market estimates, photos, and suggested listing prices. The last message, sent less than a week before I returned, confirmed an in-person meeting scheduled at the estate. Mark leaned back, closing the laptop slowly. She's trying to sell it, he said, matter-of-fact, his tone the way someone might announce a diagnosis. The simplicity of the statement made it hit harder. I sank into the nearest chair, my hands gripping the edge of the table. She hadn't just forged documents. She had been preparing to erase every trace of me from my mother's home, to turn it into cash and walk away. Mark didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for that. He simply said, I'll make copies of everything. You'll need these for your attorney. His professionalism steadied me. He backed up every file onto an encrypted drive, printed summaries, and created a digital record of the evidence. Watching him work gave me something to hold on to, a sense of order in the chaos she had created. By the time he finished installing the cameras and security systems, the sky outside had turned a bruised shade of blue. The estate was quiet, but not in the peaceful way I remembered from my childhood. It was the stillness before something breaks. Mark handed me a small device, a remote key for the locks, and showed me how to access the live feeds from my phone. You'll get alerts if anyone enters without your code, he said. And Emily, based on what I've seen, you'll want to change every password and financial account you have. She's been deeper in your life than you think. After he left, I walked through the house slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. In the faint glow of the security lights, everything looked different. The space that had once been a battleground of silence was now wired, watched, documented. It no longer belonged to her illusion of control. I sat in my mother's old chair in the study, the hum of the new system faint in the background, and stared at the evidence Mark had uncovered. The bank transfers, the emails, the plans to sell what was never hers. Each page was another layer peeled back from the facade Janet had built. It was no longer a question of family betrayal or moral failure. It was criminal, calculated, deliberate theft. I realized then that I was no longer reacting to her. I was documenting her. For the first time, the balance had shifted. The house, the records, the truth, they were mine again. It happened early on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning when the air in the mountains still holds a trace of night's chill and the sky is pale and cloudless. The kind of quiet that feels like it could last forever if left untouched. I had been sitting in the kitchen sipping coffee, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock the only sound, when the soft vibration of my phone broke the silence. The notification flashed across the screen. Motion detected, front gate camera. My heart clenched before I even looked. I knew who it was before I saw their faces. When the live feed opened, the image was grainy in the morning light but clear enough. Janet's car, a sleek black SUV that seemed to mirror her personality, polished and overbearing, was parked just outside the gate. She was standing beside it, one manicured hand gripping the metal bars, the other tapping furiously at her phone. Behind her, my father lingered near the car door, his shoulders slumped in that familiar way that always made him look smaller, quieter, as if life had gradually folded him inward. Ethan stood a few feet back, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on the gravel at his feet. I didn't move right away. I just watched them for a moment, my breath slow and even, the weight of everything that had led to this morning pressing down on me. They were trying to open the gate. I could hear the faint metallic rattle through the speaker as Janet jiggled the lock, her frustration visible even from the camera's angle. She had never been good with obstacles. She preferred to glide through life by force of manipulation rather than confrontation. The fact that the gate wouldn't yield to her must have felt like an insult. Finally, I stood and walked to the large front window overlooking the drive. The glass was cold under my fingertips as I pulled the curtain aside. From inside I could see them more clearly now, the pale light outlining their faces. Janet's expression twisted the moment she spotted movement in the house. She shouted something, my name probably, but I didn't bother to open the door. Instead, I pressed the intercom button by the window, the one connected to the gate speakers. My voice came out steady, amplified, calm in a way that surprised even me. "You're not family," I said. "You're trespassers. And this video is already recording." The words hung in the air between us, clear and final. Janet froze, her lips parting in disbelief before twisting into fury. She started shouting, her voice sharp and shrill, cutting through the mountain stillness. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught fragments: accusations, self-righteous indignation, the same rehearsed outrage she always used when her control slipped. Her hand slammed against the gate, the sound echoing faintly through the intercom. Behind her, my father didn't move. He just stood there watching me through the bars, his face pale and unreadable. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing from me to Janet and back again, the tension in his body visible even from a distance. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up my phone, turning the screen so the camera feed faced them. "I have everything," I said evenly. "The documents, the emails, the transfers, the forged signature. Every lie you've told is right here. You're not walking through that gate again." For a split second, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees, the soft hum of the camera's motor adjusting its focus. Janet's face twisted, the fury in her eyes mingled with something that looked like fear. She took a step toward the gate as if proximity could still give her power, but her voice cracked when she tried to speak. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "We're your family. This house belongs to all of us." I almost laughed, not out of amusement but out of disbelief that she still thought those words carried meaning. Family. The word had become hollow long ago, emptied by years of deceit. I looked at her and saw not a stepmother, not a matriarch, but a woman stripped of her illusions, standing on the other side of a line she could no longer cross. Then I turned my gaze to my father. He hadn't spoken once. His hands hung limply at his sides, his eyes fixed on the ground. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single night, as if the weight of everything, the lies, the silence, the complicity, had finally settled on his shoulders. For a moment I thought he might say something, anything. But he didn't. He just stood there, caught between the woman he had chosen and the daughter he had abandoned. That silence, more than Janet's screaming, was what broke whatever remained between us. I stepped closer to the window, my reflection faintly overlapping with the image of them outside, and I said quietly, but clearly enough for the intercom to catch every word, "You've chosen her for years, Dad. But this time I choose me." The air seemed to still after that. Janet's shouting faltered, her mouth still moving but her voice drowned by the emptiness around her. My father finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine through the glass, and for the first time I saw not anger or guilt, but something closer to resignation. He knew it was over. The pretense, the performance, the fragile web Janet had spun, it had all collapsed. I didn't wait for them to leave. I didn't need to. I stepped away from the window, my pulse steady, and watched through the camera feed as Janet turned back to the car, her movements sharp and jerky, her face contorted in rage she couldn't disguise. My father followed slowly, pausing once to glance back at the house before lowering his eyes again. Ethan hesitated at the gate, his expression uncertain, his shoulders hunched as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Then he climbed into the back seat and the car pulled away, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires fading into the distance. For a long moment after they were gone, I just stood there, my hands still resting on the cold glass, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a new kind of peace. The cameras were still recording, the gates still locked, the evidence still safe. Outside, the morning light had shifted, spreading across the driveway, touching the iron bars of the gate with a soft, golden gleam. For the first time in years I felt something close to freedom. Not the kind you run toward, but the kind you reclaim piece by piece after everything that tried to take it from you. It took only a few weeks for everything that had been festering in the dark to come fully into the light. After that morning at the gate, there was no hesitation left in me. I met with Lisa again, sitting across from her in her office as she carefully organized the files we had gathered, documents, screenshots, financial records, and the video footage that showed Janet and my father trying to force their way onto the property. Every page, every timestamp was a small piece of truth laid bare. When Lisa finally looked up from the stack of evidence, her expression was calm but resolute. "We have more than enough," she said. "It's time to file." Filing the lawsuit felt less like revenge and more like closure. The legal language was sterile, but every word carried years of betrayal behind it. Fraud, forgery, misappropriation of funds, attempted illegal property transfer. The district attorney's office took it seriously once they saw the evidence. Janet had been meticulous in her deceit, but she had also been arrogant. Her forged signature of mine, her falsified notary seal, the trail of money siphoned from my father's company, all of it pointed to the same truth. She had believed she would never be caught because she had spent her life controlling people, not facts. The process moved quickly once the investigation began. Lisa and I met with state prosecutors, handed over the documentation, and within weeks Janet was formally charged. I didn't attend every hearing, but the few I did were enough. Seeing her there, in a courtroom instead of behind the polished veneer she usually wore, was surreal. She still tried to project confidence, her hair perfect, her voice steady, but there was a flicker of panic in her eyes that no amount of composure could hide. Her lawyer spoke for her, spinning excuses about misunderstandings and clerical errors, but the evidence didn't care for performance. When the judge asked about the falsified deed, her voice cracked for the first time. Eventually she took a plea deal. Fraud, forgery, and attempted property theft. 3 years of probation, mandatory restitution, community service. No prison time, but a permanent record that would follow her like a shadow. Lisa told me that, in the end, Janet had no choice. The weight of proof was too heavy to fight. It should have felt like victory, but when the verdict came, what I mostly felt was exhaustion. The deep, hollow kind that seeps into your bones. It wasn't triumph. It was relief that it was finally over. The scandal spread quickly once the filings became public. Her carefully curated social circle collapsed almost overnight. The same people who had once praised her poise now whispered behind her back. The company she had been helping manage distanced itself from her entirely once her misuse of funds was confirmed. When the affair surfaced, her ongoing relationship with the real estate agent she had enlisted to sell my mother's house, it finished what little remained of her marriage. My father filed for separation quietly without lawyers or drama, just a signed paper and silence. Ethan wasn't spared either. His name had appeared in the court documents, not as a defendant but as a witness to several transactions and communications that implicated his mother. He hadn't done anything directly, but guilt by proximity is still guilt in the public eye. He lost his job within a month, a polite corporate statement citing reputational concerns. I found out from Megan, not from him. I didn't gloat or celebrate. I just let it be. He was an adult now, old enough to make his own choices, and some part of me hoped he would finally see the truth about who his mother really was. My father called me once during the aftermath. Just once. The sound of his voice caught me off guard. It had been so long since I'd heard it without anger or pretense. He didn't waste time on small talk. There was a pause, a long one, as if he were trying to find the right place to begin. I didn't know, he finally said, his tone fragile, almost childlike. Emily, I swear I didn't know what she was doing. I sat there holding the phone, my thumb tracing the edge of the table, listening to his breathing on the other end. I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but it came too late. The truth wasn't that he hadn't known. It was that he hadn't wanted to. There's a difference between ignorance and willful blindness, and he had lived in the second one for years. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost detached. You never wanted to know, I said. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. He didn't argue. He just exhaled, a sound that felt like defeat, and after a moment the line went quiet. I didn't hang up immediately. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, and then the call ended. After that, there were no more phone calls, no messages, no visits. The house was mine again in every legal and moral sense, but it felt different now. Lighter, emptier, cleansed of the tension that had haunted it for years. I began spending time there again, walking through the rooms in quiet, restoring small pieces of what my mother had left behind. Her photographs, her favorite books, the curtains she had sewn by hand, all of them slowly returning to their rightful places. When I sat on the porch one evening watching the sun sink behind the mountains, I thought about everything that had unfolded. The lies, the betrayal, the trial, the hollow apology. It struck me that justice doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it's just the quiet settling of truth into the places where deceit once lived. My mother's house stood steady against the horizon, its windows catching the last gold of the day, and for the first time in years, I felt that it belonged not just to me, but to the memory of the woman who had fought, even in death, to protect it. The house stands different now, though its bones are the same. The wide porch still faces the same horizon, the same slope of mountains my mother loved to paint at dusk, and the same pine trees whisper when the wind moves through them. But inside, the air has changed. It no longer carries the weight of conflict or the stale scent of resentment. It smells of turpentine and fresh coffee, of clay and charcoal and rain-damp canvases left to dry near the windows. Laughter echoes through the hallways again, soft music spills from open doors, and every room hums with life. What was once a battleground of silence has become a living, breathing space, reborn not as a family home but as something freer, something my mother would have understood. I called it Wild Horizon Retreat. The name came to me one evening as I stood on the porch, watching the sunlight spill over the ridge in long amber streaks, the same light that used to turn my mother's hair gold when she worked in her garden. It felt right, the word wild for her spirit, unbroken even by death, and horizon for the view she loved most, the one that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond grief and time. Now the estate belongs not to one family but to many souls searching for something, Peace, inspiration, or maybe just a place to breathe without judgment. When I first began transforming the house, it was a slow, deliberate process. I stripped away everything that wasn't mine, everything that still carried Janet's sterile precision. I took down the beige curtains, the framed prints that meant nothing, the furniture chosen to impress rather than comfort. In their place, I restored what felt human, wood worn smooth by use, soft fabrics, small imperfections that made the house feel alive again. The study became a library and writing room, filled with old typewriters and notebooks left open for anyone to use. The dining room turned into a shared studio, its long table scarred with brushstrokes and pencil marks. Even the attic, once locked and forgotten, now glows with string lights and shelves of cameras, tripods, and musical instruments waiting for someone to give them a voice. Artists began to come slowly at first, friends of friends, travelers passing through Colorado who had heard about a retreat nestled in the mountains. Then word spread. A musician from New York arrived one spring, bringing a battered cello and a quiet melancholy that filled the house with music. A painter from Oregon took over the East Room, covering the walls with wild colors that caught the sunrise. A photographer set up her darkroom in the basement, her prints drying on lines above where Janet once stored her fine china. Each person left something behind, not just art but fragments of life, of gratitude, of creation. And in exchange the house gave them something too. Stillness, space, the kind of quiet that doesn't suffocate but heals. Sometimes I think about how my mother would walk through these halls now. I imagine her running her fingers over the chipped door frames, smiling at the mismatched chairs and the laughter spilling from the kitchen. She would recognize what I've done, not because it's perfect but because it's alive. She always believed beauty lived in imperfection, in the courage to rebuild from what was broken. I like to think she would see that I've carried that belief forward, that I've turned her legacy into something more than a memory. In the evenings when the sun sinks behind the mountains and the sky bleeds into that deep, endless blue, the retreat quiets. The artists gather on the porch or by the fire pit, their conversations fading into comfortable silence. The smell of pine and smoke fills the air, and the last light of the day catches the windows, turning them to gold. I often stand at the edge of the porch then, looking out over the valley, the same view that has been with me since childhood. The house stands behind me, whole, restored, filled with warmth again. And I whisper softly so that only the wind and maybe her memory can hear, "Mom, I kept it safe." Those words always linger in the air for a moment, dissolving into the rustle of leaves. They are not an apology nor a declaration. They are a quiet promise fulfilled. My mother built this place to be a sanctuary, and though it nearly became a monument to loss, it is now what she always intended. A home for creation, for healing, for new beginnings. I no longer think of what was taken from me or what I lost. There are still scars, of course, on the walls in my heart, but they belong here too. They are reminders that survival isn't about untouched beauty. It's about endurance, about finding meaning in what remains. The family I was born into is gone, dissolved by greed and silence. But in their place I've built something stronger, something chosen. I watch the people who come here, strangers who become companions, dreamers who turn pain into art, and I realize that I'm no longer haunted by what happened. The valley grows dark, the first stars beginning to appear, and the house glows softly behind me. The laughter starts again, faint and real. I take a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, and it fills me with something close to peace. They took my family, yes, but they couldn't take my will or the love my mother left behind in the very foundations of this place. In the end, that love was enough to rebuild everything. Because sometimes, to protect what truly matters, you have to let everything else fall away. And in that falling you find what endures. You find yourself. You find home.